Hi there. Today I want to take you through a book review, and the book I want to review today is called Trekonomics, The Economics of Star Trek, and the author, Manu Saadi. It was published in 2016. It's an interesting idea to explore the political economy of a fictional galaxy based on limited references and intimations in the plot of a television and film series that has run for over 50 years, and indeed over many different sub-series under the Star Trek banner. From the outset, I've got to disclose I was never a Trekkie. I was especially interested in sci-fi when I was young and in my early teens. But I somewhere along the line, somewhere along the time, I grew out of it. And when I was into sci-fi, it was about the science. It was about the engineering that attracted me. I was never really into the human, or should I say the species drama, the various character interactions that drove a lot of the storylines. I also became somewhat cynical that by focusing on the drama instead of the science, instead of the engineering, the producers were saving money on the special effects. As to my interest in sci-fi, I really liked authors such as Arthur C. Clarke, who did focus on the engineering, who did focus on the science. And I was more probably into Star Wars than Star Trek, and more into the original Battlestar Galactica than the series that was produced in the 2000s. But science fiction has always had an interesting way of presenting alternate realities and suggesting opportunities and threats that may arise from fictional utopias and indeed dystopias. Which brings me to this review of Saadi's book. I can't obviously comment on the accuracy of his referencing of events and the history timeline within Star Trek, but I am, however, especially interested in his historical referencing of the political economy of Star Trek and how that storyline emerges and indeed develops. Star Trek, especially in the second generation timeframe, is presented as operating in a post-scarcity economic frame, where market and economic transactions, especially among the inhabitants of the United Federation of Planets, is redundant. I'll ignore the immediate issue that the great bulk of Star Trek storylines occur in a military hierarchical context, on starships and installations controlled and managed by a Starfleet command, which operates in a clear military hierarchical organisational structure. It isn't about individual interactions, and it isn't about consumer interactions. And the structure of the government appears to be managed by benevolent, technocratic, ruling class, indeed operatives. An interesting idea that is suggested in Saadi's book is that there is no labour market as we would understand it, with no direct financial compensation paid. But I noted from time to time in some episodes that I've watched, credits, euphemistically called credits, essentially the currency, were used to purchase drinks, etc., at the Starship bar. This is important to remember when deconstructing the Star Trek political economy. I was especially reminded recently of Saadi's book by a tweet by Michael Shermer in July 2018, when he directly cited the book, and he directly talked about the issue about, admittedly in only 140 odd characters, talked about political scarcity and the opportunities that were reflected and are identified about scarcity and about scarcity economics in Saadi's book. Which got me to thinking, having read the book in 2017, Shermer's tweet reminded me of the whole concept, and especially interesting given how macro politics, especially in Western countries, is somewhat splintering with the entry and re-emergence of old and new competing political philosophies about how to manage and distribute scarce economic resources. And why not consider how a fictional utopian universe has resolved the problem, where the Star Trek federations have put aside, if not outright dumped, the classical profit and growth-focused economic system, and indeed has abandoned fiat money in favour of a distribution system that promotes and serves personal development as a direct means of overcoming scarcity. So just very quickly, what is this thing called scarcity from an economic frame? Scarcity is a function of supply and demand. In simple terms, if there is too much demand and not enough supply of a good or service, not enough supply of a good or service, it may develop, therefore, into an element or a degree of scarcity. It causes a disequilibrium. A key illustration is price, where the price of a good or a service in question is a direct reflection of that supply and demand function. So the price of a scarce good or service ought to increase until an equilibrium is reached between supply and demand. A key issue to note per this discussion with reference to Trekonomics is that given that there is no pricing in Star Trek, it effectively overcomes the problem of restricting or indeed actively excluding the availability of a good or service to those who can or will be able to pay. Of course, real markets don't always function as they should. Mismatched levels of supply and demand occur frequently. So the individual or retail consumer is constantly faced with running their own cost-benefit analysis, especially when the price reflected in demand is high, but supply is low. So the question is the benefit or satisfaction received from acquiring the good or service higher than the financial pain of paying the higher cost or price? If you look to social psychology, advertisers and marketers especially use the scarcity function as a sales tactic to drive demand and indeed sales. So what is this thing called post-scarcity? In the Star Trek universe, the post-scarcity problems seem to have been overcome. Post-scarcity is effectively a theory. It suggests that in an economic circumstance in which goods or services can be produced in abundance with ideally little to no human effort or labour, and the quantities that are produced are accessible to people cheaply and or are indeed free. However, people like Philip Sadler suggest that in such a circumstance, if there is ever to be achieved, scarcity has not been abolished, rather that the articulated basic needs can and are met, and indeed some desirable goods and services may be available. So scarcity of some things, be it technology, be it goods, be it indeed services, may still exist in a inverted commas post-scarcity environment, post-scarcity system, post-scarcity world, in Star Trek, post-scarcity galaxy or universe. But indeed, that scarcity in this context needs to be considered in terms of basic goods, those goods that manage and provide a means of survival. So in Star Trek, wealth, however that is defined, most probably means the satisfaction of basic survival needs as well as the provision of merit goods and services, e.g. education, and which are provided in inverted commas, in abundance, with goods fulfillment especially, is no longer a driver of personal ambition or indeed the need to aggregate and obtain wealth is no longer a personal goal of personal ambition. And the human capital is the main commodity in the political economy, in this political universe. It is the final result of a services economy, and that is a question. And the questions not only, are not satisfied in Star Trek as to how these needs would be understood and agreed. There's no broad definitional matrix or framework or method, and how they would be measured and how those same would be reassessed and redetermined given changing circumstances. A key element in the Star Trek universe about achieving a type of economy, of a post-scarcity economy, is technology and technological advancements. And in the Star Trek system, the most obvious example is the Replicator, a type of glorified 3D printer. At least from the episodes of the various Star Trek programs that I've watched, the Replicator can generate free, potentially unlimited public goods, goods that through their own consumption don't reduce the amount available to other people. And once generated, you can't stop anyone from consuming it. For the purposes of Star Trek, food, which seems to be the Replicator's main function, is provided free at no opportunity cost, and food is provided regardless of merit or rank. It is interesting that there doesn't seem to be a weight problem amongst the characters. Perhaps you can order as much baked cheesecake as you want, but the calorie and dietary quality of the food that is produced is scientifically compensated within the food itself. So you can't get fat eating as much baked cheesecake as you want. Otherwise, if supply is unlimited, of course, does demand for food increase proportionally? A question I think Star Wars or Star Trek, here I go mixing up my fictional universes, Star Trek has not answered. And throughout, no money is ever exchanged. Of course, the replicator is used on the Starship where money exchange, which probably has not only been abolished by the Federation, on a Starship probably has no function. And consequently, there are no private goods. That ownership and control is able to be excluded from others because of that ownership and control is by default collective. And to make the post-scarcity society work, technology probably and must be the key, just as robotization and artificial intelligence is becoming a key area of political as well as economic interest in contemporary society outside of the Star Trek universe, in the real world. A lot of that would need to be, a lot of robotization and artificial intelligence would need to be going on in a post-scarcity environment with at least the day-to-day chores and manufacturing functions undertaken by robotics and the like. But in Star Trek, it's really quite interesting that there seems to be little artificial intelligence. Perhaps it's just assumed that it's going on in the background. Yes, there's the occasional reference to the computer on the Starship, but the computer is doing a lot of background functions, it seems to me, about managing the Starship, not about managing the political economy of its human inhabitants. An interesting point, though, is the character Data, which seems to be the only android on the second generation series. And it's interesting as to what that may mean. Is it deliberate, or is Data too expensive to be for a Starship to only have one allocated? And why only one? Again, is it part of the drama and the characterization, or is it something more broader that's being suggested? And while the focus is on the production of goods, particularly with the replicator as a piece of technology, the key driver of the Star Trek political economy identified by Saadi is that of reputation or indeed merit. And you can see that in the way the Data character is trying to become more human, is to understand human ideas, human concepts, and human behaviour. And an interesting part of all this, a part of this idea of that the key driver of this political economy is reputation or merit, and indeed achievement and personal success in academia or in public service, etc., are the key elements that drive this behavioural economics of the Star Trek system. And it is interesting that questions such as personal comparative advantage are not addressed in Star Trek, and nor indeed how personal self-interest or indeed greed or ambition are managed. And it is interesting that the characters overall of the Federation operate in this post-scarcity framework, where they're not their ambition is not based on greed, it's not based on money, it's not based on personal or financial profit, but it's based around improving their own intellectual capabilities, their own physical capabilities. But however, there are, interestingly, other characters that come into this world who have obviously different frames and different considerations. So you've got the Borg, the ultimate collectivists. They live in a perfect post-scarcity society, mutually beneficial society with constant redistribution of goods and services allocated per the collective benefit exclusively. Then you have the Klingons. They operate in a war economy where battle and warfare are the principal drivers of their own political economy, and everything is considered through that frame. Then you have, interestingly, the Ferengi, a mercantile-focused people, commercially focused people. And it's suggested by Saadi that through the development of the various series, they end up becoming Keynesians, and if indeed post-Keynesians. So to conclude my short summary, Adam Smith wrote that markets create the relations of mutual obligations based ultimately on trust. And there must be lots of trust in the Star Trek economy for it to work. That no one, for example, will seek to profit from another. And I think the idea of trust is indeed the idea that Jet provides the agreed dynamism of a post-scarcity political economy, and indeed the dynamism of such an economy working in the Star Trek universe. And post-scarcity is indeed the political economy that would make something like Star Trek in terms of its environment work, because without an appreciation of scarcity and then the fulfillment of basic needs and basic requirements, universal basic requirements, you couldn't then have, at least from a dramatic, let alone a physical, philosophical and a political economy, you couldn't then address the resulting questions. I've got to say, I really enjoyed Saadi's book. I could recommend that you get a copy, even if you aren't a Star Trek fan, because in a sense, Star Trek, the universe, provides the framework to assess these broader questions of scarcity and the political economy of that. And again, these broader questions about the role of artificial intelligence and robotics to provide the mechanisms to achieve a post-scarcity political world. Anyway, enough for that. Hopefully I've triggered some questions and some comments, good, bad, and indifferent. Please let me know in the comments below. And again, my contact details are scattered all over this YouTube page in terms of my LinkedIn and particularly my Twitter. So please let me know what you think, good, bad, or indifferent. Thank you.